So in this episode of the All Things Property podcast, this is episode 5 of 6, and today we're going to be talking about pets in rental properties. Who really gets the final say? And I'm pleased to say that Ian and I are joined by Ted. I'm not sure how much he will participate, but probably apt for him to be sitting in and listening to what happens in terms of pets in rental properties. Welcome to the All Things Property podcast with me, Simon Bacon of Preferential Properties. Every week, Ian Sadler and I will delve into all things property. We'll guide you through with friendly, no-nonsense advice. Now, pets in rental properties has probably been one of the most talked about aspects of the new legislation. What is the key principle as far as you understand it, Ian?
I think you're far better placed to explain that now,
Okay.
Simon.
Well, let me say then that the key principle in the new legislation is that tenants will have the right to request permission for a pet, and landlords will not be able to unreasonably refuse. So, Ian, do you often get requests from tenants for pets in properties that you rent?
Yeah, at viewings, yeah. And existing tenants.
And what's your general
process.
response to those?
Not the expected one, maybe. I've always been of the mind to assess the people who control and own the pet rather than the pet themselves. So if you've got responsible tenants, new tenants or existing tenants, and they want to bring a pet into property, the way they approach it's important. Totally upfront to begin with. We have 2 cats or a dog who's 9 years old and house trained and so on. Then, if I feel they're responsible tenants, I would quite happily agree to it.
Okay, all right.
It's more important. The tenants are more important in a weird way than the pet. To me.
That's an interesting concept. I wonder what landlords would say of that. I'd also wonder what tenants would say of that. So, from a landlord's perspective, why do you think landlords? Well, put it another way: if you're a landlord and you got asked to have a pet in your property, what would you say? Would you be in favour of it, or would you be trying to put barriers up? And I think, certainly the experience I've got is I've probably got both of those. Landlords who want to put barriers up, and also landlords who will embrace it.
Preconceptions that often turn out to be misconceptions about the damage pets can cause.
Yeah, but let's be honest, pets can cause damage. What kind of damage can they cause? Why would a landlord go, what makes a landlord go, actually I don't want a pet in my property?
Well, I guess if it's a dog, then a potential smell on carpets ingrained. If it's a cat, a regular one is clawing the carpet at doors and damaging the carpet. But all these things,
there's so much more than that, though, isn't there, Ian? There's, fleas. There's pest control. There's, damage. There's, dare I say it, poo in the garden. Lawns get damaged by dogs.
You're doing exactly what landlords do, which is go down the worst possible route.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got a pet. I've got a dog. I've got 2 dogs.
Okay, this is my dog.
Right, I'm a responsible adult. You are nearly a responsible adult.
Okay.
My dogs don't cause any damage in the property. They're well behaved. They poo in the garden. I pick it up.
Yeah.
They don't damage doors, kitchen units, because they're well looked after and they're well trained.
When Ted goes to the loo in the garden, has a wee in the garden, does he burn the grass?
Is he a boy?
Yes.
Then he doesn't.
He does.
Wow.
Okay. So, do you only limit female dogs or male dogs? Because one.
I think.
But that's.
It's when humans live in houses, they scuff the walls, they walk down an entrance hall, down the stairs, and you get dark scuff marks down there. That is wear and tear. Yeah. If you agree to have a pet in the house, in the tenancy, and he pees in the garden, burns the grass, wear and tear, not damage.
Is it? Because if I didn't have
it's
a dog,
life.
If I didn't
Dogs
have a
pee.
dog though, but if I didn't have a dog, then the lawn wouldn't get burned, and therefore, why should the landlord have to pay to? Because if you, would a tenant want to move into a property where the lawn has been burned? Is that right?
You have a big dog and he must get rid of gallons of pee, I guess, which burns your lawn dramatically. That's not the norm. I've got 2 dogs and there's not a sufficient area in my lawn burned that would make me want to get rid of the dogs or prevent a tenant moving into the property.
But does that make it, is a landlord, this comes back to, I suppose, one of those cruxes. Is a landlord responsible for the actions of a tenant? Is it fair wear and tear if the lawn is burned or there is dog poo in the flower beds or the flower borders?
That's your second example. No, of course it's not, because part of keeping a pet is picking up after them in the garden.
Okay, so what's your understanding then of what the legislation is going to say in terms of, extra deposit or putting
On the
it
grass?
in other controls to pet owners?
Such as increasing
Increasing the deposit then.
Okay, what the new rules say about
You
that?
can't.
Right.
Because the law says, the legislation is exactly the same, that the maximum security deposit you can have is 5 weeks rent as deposit. So in the past, landlords have often asked for an extra deposit to cover, damage by pets. There are clauses you can put in, such as carpets must be professionally cleaned, but I also know over my experience that you can't always tell whether a carpet's got fleas until a tenant has moved out, and suddenly 2 or 3 weeks later you notice that there are fleas in the property, by which time you've already returned the tenant security deposit. Is it right that a landlord should be responsible for that?
You make a decision at the start of a tenancy to choose what you consider to be the most suitable tenant. For me, pets are just as likely to cause damage as humans. If you're playing devil's advocate, if you've got 2 parties both want the property, one is professional couple, perfect credit history, good track record with the letting agents, they've got a dog. The other couple, whatever their circumstances, maybe their job status isn't correct, or they need a guarantor, or something in their background makes you think, well, they're not as good potentially as the other ones. Would you take the 2 professionals, clean credit history, clean rental history, with a pet?
That's not a fair question. The question should be, no, it's not. The fair question is, you've got 2 identical couples, professional couple earning the same money with the same number of children and everything else. So you've got 2 identical couples, and one has got a dog and one doesn't have a dog. That's the question.
They're not identical.
But they are. That's
my example wasn't yours. You're saying they are.
Yeah. So you could say, well, I've chosen somebody with a dog because they are absolutely the best person, but the reality could be you could have 2 identical people, 2 professionals or 2 full-time employed people doing similar jobs, going into a property. Would you choose the one with a dog or without a dog?
Well, the natural angle would be you choose the one without the dog.
Yeah.
But a bad tenant can cause far more damage than a bad dog.
Absolutely. I absolutely get that.
It'd be interesting to know the statistics, but how many people have pets in their lives? 50%?
I don't know.
It can't be far off that. So life is that 50% of your tenant demographic have pets. So to have a policy that precludes any kind of pet in the property, regardless of the owner, it would be limiting yourself severely.
Which is, in fairness, why I think the legislation has been brought in, and why there is such a focus on it, in terms of, is it fair and reasonable to preclude somebody from renting a property because they have a pet?
No.
So, but if you choose a tenant, going back to your scenario, if you choose a tenant based on, that they don't have a dog, but they then are in the property and then they ask for a dog, or a cat or something, where do we stand on that? What if they are, as you put it, not your ideal tenant? You know, where they're perhaps they're not looking after the property in the way that you would like them. You go and do your inspection and you notice that I don't know, the property's not being looked after in as well as you would like it to, and then they ask if they can have let's focus on dogs, because we've got a dog sat here, although he just goes where he wants to. But yeah, what would you do? How would you?
Well, your starting point would say you wouldn't say the landlord, would you? Would rather not.
But you can't. Is that unreasonable behaviour?
It's saying no is unreasonable.
Okay.
Discussing
so,
the prospect
I'd rather
of it.
you didn't have a dog. That's not going to cut it, is it? Because you've got to be definitive. Yes, you can have a dog, or no, you can't. But you won't let me have a dog. Why are you not letting me have a dog, Mr. Sadler?
This is where it gets awkward, isn't it? Because you can't actually say reality is different to the proposals the legislation's making.
So the only way, there are things that you can determine. Is the property reasonable for a pet? So, I would have said, and I'm not being funny here, that if I was living in a one-bedroom house, a small Victorian terraced house, would the size of the dog determine whether the property is reasonable?
Yes.
Okay, so that could be a ground then. If I lived in a flat, could I decline having a pet? What would I have to consider? What could I consider as a landlord then?
Well, if somebody said, I want to get a house cat and I live in a flat, then you'd have to consider that. But if somebody said they wanted a dog or two dogs, then the exercise aspect of a dog and the fresh air aspect of it. But it's okay saying...
Surely leases, landlords need to understand their leases, don't they?
Yeah.
So, again, one of the things I would encourage all landlords to do, if you have a flat that you rent out, or a leasehold property where there is a lease involved, you need to know very clearly whether or not the lease stipulates whether or not you can have a pet or not. Information finding at the earliest possible stage means that if you are going to decline a pet of any description, you need to have a justifiable reason for doing it. A lease or a head lease is a justifiable reason.
Yeah, but as a standard freehold property, a reason for denying is subjective, isn't it? It can be challenged. And what happens then? So, tenant asks for a dog, landlord says no. What can a tenant do? What recourse do they have?
They can challenge it, and they
Where?
can say, under the terms of the current legislation, I am entitled to, I can have a pet unless you give me reasonable grounds for saying no.
Which reasonable grounds are going to... It's too woolly, isn't it? They're all going to be subjective.
So they go to the property ombudsman and say, I am being declined a tenancy, or I'm being declined a pet, sorry Ted, on the basis that, the landlord is being unreasonable. So there are grounds for them to be able to do that. What else?
Too woolly.
It is, but what
Like
else
your
could
dog.
a landlord?
Too woolly.
What else could a landlord do if they get a pet request?
God, it's so difficult to be seen to be reasonable, isn't it?
It is, but I think there are things that we as letting agents can do to support both landlords and tenants. It's a pet owner has to be seen to be responsible, and that is either through making sure that the pet has pet insurance, that they are have their worms and their fleas done on a regular basis. You could make sure that my personal view is, if I was a landlord and I was asked if if my tenant could have a pet, what mechanisms, what would I do to try and justify my decision? Well, I'd want to know what kind of pet it was. Is it house trained? Is it left alone during the day? Do you both go out to work? Is it left alone all day? What arrangements have you got for looking after that dog? Who are the vets? Is it microchipped? Does it meet with compliance in terms of pet legislation? So they're all the things that I think landlords and us as letting agents should be doing to work with landlords and tenants to say, Mr. Landlord, Mrs. Landlord, you are going to likely get more requests from tenants for pets. What can we do to safeguard you? But also from a tenant's perspective, if you want to have a pet, what can we do to facilitate your request? Show us that by having a pet, the landlord is not going to be materially affected by you having a pet in the property. Don't you agree?
Yeah, the more more caveats you can put in place, the better, really.
So let's go back then to the first question. So pets in rental properties, who really gets the final say? Who do you think it is?
The agent acting on behalf of the landlord on their instructions.
I think the landlord will still have the final say, but the final say has to be based on reasonable grounds.
And advice from the agent.
Yes, and the tenant has to show that they are responsible and that the pet that they are looking to have is reasonable for the property, and we need to look at what mechanisms can be put in place as addendums to tenancy agreements to aid both parties, because ultimately we go back to that same question, the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. The landlord wants a tenant who is going to look after the property, and the tenant wants to live in a property where they can make it feel like their home. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end this particular episode. So we know that the issue of pets in properties is probably one of the most contentious issues that landlords and tenants face. We would really welcome hearing your views on whether pets should be allowed in properties or not, and if they should be, then what precautions, what mechanisms can be put in place to protect all parties. So if you're a landlord or a tenant and want advice around pets in properties, please do give us a call. We'll be happy to help. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the All Things Property podcast. If you found this episode useful, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These things really help us reach the people who need to hear this advice. See you next week.